Let's begin in prayer. God, as we reflect today in your scriptures and in our hearts about simplicity and what that means in our faith and in our lives, we pray for the courage to look inside and find that which we can return to the heart of the matter and the purpose from which we first started. For we ask it in your Son's name. Amen. In 2015, the median square footage of new single-family homes that were sold in America peaked at an all-time high, or should I say largeness, of 2,520 square feet. That's the median. But as often happens in society, there's a pendulum swing. And as the square footage of homes being sold was peaking, so was the rise of the tiny house movement. If you've never seen tiny houses, I invite you to peruse HGTV. They have plenty of shows where they seek out tiny homes and you can see what they're like. But tiny homes are homes that are generally less than 500 square feet. They can be put on platform trailers and taken different places. The movement sprung from the desire to live more simply. And where else to start living more simply than literally where you live? So occupants of these tiny homes opted for less possessions and a more free and adventuresome lifestyle. Tiny home owners could purchase a home for as little as $25,000. They had less stuff, less stress, and more focus and resources to spend on what they truly loved and were passionate about. They also reported increased levels of happiness and peace as a result of a more simple lifestyle. Simplicity, if you look in Merriam-Webster, is defined as the state of being simple, uncomplicated, or uncompounded. Now, that's one of my pet peeves. When you define something and you use the root word in the definition, that drives me crazy. So simple, okay, what does simple mean? I believe simple is what you're left with when you pull away the facade and the image and the expectations and the busyness, and you get at the root of why you started in the first place. Simple is knowing your values, and simplicity means you make decisions in your life based on what upholds or fulfills those values. I think simplicity is considered a virtue because a failure to practice simplicity can blind you or bind you from experiencing the fullness of those people and those tenets that you do value. The best metaphor I have for simplicity is actually in the form of a vegetable. And if you know me well, I don't generally eat vegetables if I can help it. But this vegetable gives the best metaphor I can think of, and it's an artichoke. The best part of the artichoke is the heart, right? That's where the rich and natural buttery flavor is. You don't usually have to dip the heart of an artichoke in the butter, just the leaves. It's where most of the nutrients are found. It's the goodness, the fullness of it. The leaves contain a taste of that goodness, but you get just a tiny bit. It really pales in comparison to the heart. Simplicity is like the heart of an artichoke. If we spend too much time peeling away at the leaves, we miss out. You might be exhausted or full by the time you reach the center. Or worse, you get so distracted in the individual leaves and what they have or don't have to offer that you lose sight of your goal altogether. Simplicity is like the heart of an artichoke. It's the best of what life has to offer. Our faith has much to teach us about how it is we live into this simplicity and what happens when we get lost plucking leaves and how it is we return to that heart that we seek. The first laws that directed the Israelites on how to be faithful and how to survive as this nomadic community were anything but simple. And there were a lot of them. In the Hebrew Bible, you can find 613 mitzvah, or commandments. 613. Now, the purpose of every single one of these 613 really boiled down to three kind of main umbrellas. One was remembering and honoring the past acts of God. Another was preserving the health of individuals and community. And another was maintaining justice. So these 613 fit under basically one of those three umbrellas. But there were so many specific laws that it was really easy to get lost in the semantics. So let's look at one of these mitzvah to give you an idea. It's from the book of Leviticus in the 11th chapter. And it's titled, and I love titles in the Bible. This one says, What to Do with the Carcass of an Animal. In case you're wondering, you're about to learn. It starts in verse 39. If any animal of which you eat may die, anyone who touches its carcass shall be unclean until the evening. Those who eat of its carcass shall wash their clothes and be unclean until the evening, and those who carry the carcass shall wash their clothes and be unclean until the evening. Well, that's almost 3 rules in one, right? You've got somebody who's eating it, somebody who's touching it, and somebody who's carrying it, which makes me think, how can you carry it without touching it? But that's a different question. You read this and you think, this is not really helpful in my life of faith in 2018. But in antiquity, before an understanding of medicine and disease, this mitzvah about the carcass of an animal could have saved lives, because the animal in question was likely sick or carrying some disease. And so this commandment seeks to name unclean those who may be infected by that disease and to keep them out of the community so that they don't infect the others until the disease may be gone or less susceptible. And if we take the time to look back at the purpose of the why of that mitzvah, then we can understand why they have an entire heading about what to do with an animal carcass. But as humans do, we get lost in the details, right? We spend time figuring out, well, when exactly does evening begin and when does it end? And did the unclean person properly clean their clothes? And the question I ask, what's the difference between touching and carrying a carcass anyway? This type of questioning reminds me how quickly we lose sight of things when it comes to our homes. I mean, how many of us have obsessed about the hardware of the vanity in our extra bathroom, or the brick pavers that we put under our trash cans on the side of our garage? And we stress over these details, and we completely lose sight of the original purpose for our home, which was to provide shelter for ourselves and our families. We've lost sight of the purpose and the heart of the matter. And I think the same thing happens with these mitzvah. The Sadducees and the Pharisees started keeping lists and scores. They got lost in the leaves, so to speak. They became obsessed with who followed which law and how and who didn't. And they wanted to call out the rule breakers. They lost sight of the heart of the matter, which was to preserve health and justice and a history, and instead wanted to create categories of righteous and unrighteous. And one of the most popular examples of this from the Gospels is when Jesus and his disciples are walking through the fields on the Sabbath, and they're hungry, and so they're plucking grain, and the Sadducees try to catch them breaking one of the mitzvah. And they say, look, even Jesus' disciples break the law of the Sabbath. See, they're working on the Sabbath by plucking grain. And Jesus replies to them, is it better to preserve life or take it on the Sabbath? In his semi-snarky remark, Jesus shows he gets the purpose behind this mitzvah. He understands the heart of it. That's why we say again and again, Jesus came to fulfill the law, not abolish it. There are multiple times when Jesus is tested and tried by the Sadducees and the Pharisees as they attempt to catch him in the process of breaking or disrespecting the mitzvah in some way. But they're unable to do so. And I want you to hear the words that follow one of these attempts, and it starts in Matthew 22. When the Pharisees heard that he, Jesus, had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Perhaps another way to understand that phrase, hang all the law and the prophets, is to say that these 2 commandments, loving God and loving the neighbor, are the heart of it. And the rest are the leaves of the artichoke. Important, sure, but don't lose sight of the simplicity of the heart. Friends, our faith is really quite simple. Love God then love your neighbor. Period. Here's your Cliff Notes for the entire Bible. Love God, love your neighbor. Now that we've identified the heart of our faith, let's move to the how, because the how is markedly more difficult to define. What does simplicity look like in our lives that demand that we keep all these plates spinning in the air at the same time? Well, ironically, it looks like work. Simplicity is not achieved by ignoring your responsibilities and living out a backpack for the rest of your life. Simplicity is a conscience and constant discipline to focus on the heart of what really matters. And I want to suggest there's 3 ways that we can simplify our lives that are biblically based and highly recommended by the faithful ancestors that came before us. Now, the first of these is that we have to learn to say no. And the one person who's probably helped me grow the most in this is actually Bob. I can't tell you how many meetings I've come out of, meetings where I agree or volunteer myself to do half of whatever the agenda work tasks were. And I'll come back and the next day there'll be a Post-it note on my computer screen that says, "Learn to say no. Love, Bob." I think I'm uphill challenge, but one that I can honestly say I'm getting a little bit better at. And Jesus speaks about how important it is to have our no mean no and our yes mean yes when he preaches following the Sermon on the Mount in the 5th chapter. Writes, "Again, you have heard that it was said of those of ancient times, 'You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you've made to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one." It is hard to let our yes mean yes when you say yes to everything. Yes, I'll serve on that committee. Oh, no one signed up to be a classroom parent? Yes, I'll do it. Yes, I'll run that 5K with you, or host that dinner, or be at that play, or attend that fundraiser. Yes, yeah, I'll be there. Except then you look at your calendar, and you have to leave that fundraiser early so that you can attend that play, or at least the second half of it. Or you call in sick to the 5K because you're not prepared for the class party the next day. When that happens, your yeses don't mean yes. If you would have started with no, then you could stand firm in your yes. Let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. And although Jesus didn't say it, I would add, don't be afraid to say no. I've learned through trial and error, and mostly error and stress, that no would have been far easier to lead with than trying to be the yes person to everyone. Step 1 to living with more simplicity is to follow the advice of Jesus and let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. And then the advice tacked on to the end is you actually have to say no to achieve the simplicity you're after. A second way we can simplify our lives is to follow one of the 10 commandments from the book of Exodus. Moses brought down the commandments, and this one reads, "You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I am the Lord your God. Make for yourselves no other idol." The kids that were up here and went downstairs today are learning about this very story in our church school. And they're learning that when Moses went up to the mountains to be holy and responsible, and Aaron is down on sea level with all these impatient Israelites. And they're getting really impatient, and so they decide to cast for themselves this golden calf, which I can tell you does not go well for them when Moses gets down from the mountain, and they're rebuked. And so we have this commandment of not casting idols. But it's far more than casting a golden calf. I think if I stood up in this pulpit and said, hey, don't just try to resist the urge to make a calf out of gold, I think most of us would be like, I'm good, yeah. But that's not what it's about. What it's about is more real than that. What it's about is in casting ourselves an image or a reputation or something that we are idolizing so much that we're putting that before God and what we value. This law gets at what is most vulnerable, what really occupies our stress and leads us to a life that is anything but simple. And if I'm going to be vulnerable with you, what it is for me is this image of this superhero working mom that I want to be. I want to be that mom who balances her career and her family like it's no big thing. That mom that takes time to work out regularly and your home is always company ready at all times. A person who feeds their family healthy home-cooked meals and their children happily eat broccoli, go on meaningful vacations, and still manages time for family and friends. I want to be that mythical hero mom, so I have turned myself inside out chasing this image, idolizing this image. And I have lived anything but simply. I've lived stressfully. But what if I began taking this commandment seriously? What if instead of having an idol of working mom of the year, I idolized what it meant to be made in the image of God? If I return to the heart of what I love? Because I believe if we confront this commandment honestly in ourselves, that we will experience more simplicity. Because I was not created in the image of a supermom. I was created in the image of God. And the image of God does not require us to achieve perfection. It suggests instead that we are already perfectly made. It challenges us to love others for how they were perfectly made. That sounds far more simple than the image I've been idolizing. The final advice is really quite self-explanatory. It's from the wisdom writer of Ecclesiastes, and it's about materialism. It comes from the 2nd chapter. The wisdom writer says, "I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. Bought male and female slaves. I had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem." This guy doesn't have issues with humility, as you can tell. "I also gathered for myself silver and gold and treasures of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, delights of the flesh. And I became great and surpassed all who were with me, or all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had spent in doing it. And again, all was vanity, and a chasing after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun." Really know that I have to unpack that one for you, right? You gotta have everything, and it wasn't worth it. For over 2,000 years, we've been told by really wise people that wealth and materialism cannot buy us a meaningful life and happiness, and yet we're still kind of on a painful learning curve in that, aren't we? I feel like it's easy to accept this in theory, but it's much harder to follow it in practice. We move further and further from simplicity as we try to keep up with the Joneses. And oftentimes, the image of a life we idolize and materialism go hand in hand. So as we honestly address that image we idolize, so too will we address what we really need to make that image be fulfilled. And so our materialism and our spending habits are also called into question. Experiencing the virtue of simplicity in our lives is not this new age trend that requires you to buy a tiny house and cut your cable. It is deeper and far more spiritual than that. It is written in the core of who we are as God's people. And it's going to take work. But if you've ever eaten canned artichoke hearts, you know that they don't taste anything like the real thing, right? Each part you peel back, each no that means no, each idolized image you refuse to chase, and each material good you tell yourself you don't need is like a leaf peeled back. Sure, there may be some goodness in it, but it's small and fleeting and pales in comparison to the heart. As you practice simplicity and peel these away, you get closer to experience what you set out to experience in the first place. You get closer to your values of faith and family and justice and peace. You get closer to loving God and loving your neighbor. So as you seek simplicity in your life, remember these three things. Learn to say no and mean it. Check who or what you're idolizing and reorient it, because the image of God is far more life-giving than the image of the superhuman version of yourself that you're seeking. And 3, don't buy more stuff. You don't need it. Each time you make these steps, you peel away a leaf. And as you do so, you return to the heart of our faith, the heart of what God desired for us. Love God. Love people. It's as simple as that. Amen.